I'm here today. I'm talking about a subject I'm very passionate about: the United States of America. I feel very blessed that when you talk about the American dream, I feel like I lived that dream. I came from a working class family. Nobody in my family had ever gone to college. My dad was a laborer. He was in the building construction trades union. And I think about the possibility of American life. And I know I'm addressing you today. This is not an easy time for the country. I'm not wearing rose-tinted glasses here. I know that arguably since the Civil War, we haven't been this divided. Although, I must say, I watched the 1968 series this weekend, and I think that was also a very hard time for our country. But I know that there's a lot of angst out there, but I do want to talk to what I think is a framework that is going to help us going forward. And so, I do want to thank Johan with the Bruderhof community and everyone else who helped sponsor, because you're going to get a copy of this book that I'm speaking to you about today. And I know some of you may have to go as soon as I'm done and may not have time to have it signed. Steve Bolger will make sure we have books available on the other door too if you have to leave. But I do hope that you read this, that you take some time to go through this book, not only for the policy prescriptions, which I feel very strongly about, but also the personal stories. This is in many ways, and this is a school of hard knocks. Me sharing with you a lot of the mistakes I've made along the way and things I've learned from it, and also some very personal stories. Personal stories, including paratroopers who I lost in combat. And I think it's really important that we tell their stories of heroism and sacrifice. We're coming through a period, Memorial Day weekend here, and a lot is said is, how do we honor those who gave their life for us? And for me, this has always meant this, is that every day that we rise, we individually, we give the best that we can to make our country stronger, to make our community better. I think in that way we do honor the sacrifices. And so in chapter 1 of Rally Point, I do share with you Chris Pusateri, Zach Wobbler, two great Americans who were killed in action in Iraq, and I hope that you'll appreciate their stories. So, as we look out today on the landscape, and we try to find ways to find a commonality, to find a common voice, what I think is critically important is to recognize this exceptional nation. It's often mentioned, American exceptionalism. And what I want to do is spend a few moments just laying that out before I take your responses and questions. And when you think about American exceptionalism, how is it that we were different from the rest of the world? I think it's first important to recognize that we truly escaped history. The history of political change before America was violent. We had kings and we had queens, we had aristocracy, they ruled for a period of time, right? This was a period when essentially the crown had an allegiance with the church, and I'm a devout Catholic, but I need to speak truth to power here. The crown and the church had an alliance, and what they were offering was security in this life and salvation in the next. But beyond that, that's what they were offering, security and salvation. When you look at the natural rights that our founders articulated in Philadelphia in 1776, that Declaration of Independence, some of the most summoning words ever penned. It talked about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These were natural rights that came from God. And government's responsibility was to secure those rights. Arguably, the most radical was the pursuit of happiness. It's a shame the translation from the Greek, it's the word eudaimonia. But the whole point is the pursuit of happiness was that in each and every one of us, we have a spark from the divine that we are entitled to our own potential. That's what made us different. In the old world, you were born to surf and you die to surf. It's just the way it was. Our founders said no, that you have a God-given right to your own potential. That was incredibly powerful. And the idea that we could govern ourselves, that was radical. It was crazy talk, quite frankly. This was a period when there was a thought that we had to have kings and queens or we were going to devolve into civil war. But the Declaration of Independence gave the possibility for a new life for us. I mentioned coming from a working class family, the possibility that I could rise to my God-given potential, and to you as well. And after that war, when we secured our independence, we had liberty. and we had chaos. We had chaos. I mean, for the first decade, it was looking like it was going to fail. By the way, the heads of state of Europe predicted it would fail. And when I would, talk to our constituents about that, say, what do you mean? The heads of state of Europe truly believed that we were going to beg for the monarchy to come back. And I know, exactly. That's the response I would get. People would laugh. Surely they didn't think we would beg for them to come back. But you know what? They batted 1 for 2. You bat 1 for 2 in baseball, you're going to go to Cooperstown, the Hall of Fame, right? I mean, our contemporary was the French Revolution. And the French Revolution, some thought, arguably had more loftier goals than us, but they never anchored it in a constitution. And ultimately, it devolved into chaos. And we had the Reign of Terror in France under Robespierre. And ultimately, the French people were so exasperated, they begged for the monarchy to come back in the form of Napoleon. We never did that. We never did this. This country not only survived, it has flourished because of American exceptionalism. But that spirit of Philadelphia with the Declaration couldn't have worked if it were not for the Constitution. That's really the document that I want to talk about today, because this is not an effort to bring us back to the 18th century. No. This is about finding the richness of American exceptionalism to go forward in the 21st century, which should be our best century yet. And it's important to recognize with the spirit of Philadelphia Part 2, the Constitution, is that our leaders came together to not only secure liberty, but to actually balance it, so that we can have a balance between liberty and security. And that's when they brought forward the Constitution. But the Constitution itself nearly didn't come into existence because they had tried to amend the Articles a number of times, and they couldn't reach a consensus. But what finally got George Washington off the farm again was the Shays Rebellion. Not far from here, actually, in Springfield, Massachusetts. Daniel Shays was a young man at 18 years old after Bunker Hill. He said, you know what, this is a cause worth fighting for. He came and enlisted on behalf of this revolution, and he fought the entire time. He fought for 7 years, rose to the rank of captain. It was an inspirational figure. And when he was done fighting and he went back home, the government showed up at his door. And they said, we want your tax to pay for this debt. And he said, I'd be happy to pay it, but I need you to pay for me for my time as a soldier, and I'll give it right back to you. Well, we said, we can't do that, but we want your tax money anyways. How tragically ironic was that a country that was really founded in large measure in a tax revolt, that we were going after one of our greatest patriots. Well, Shays said, this will not stand. And he stood to fight. And when George Washington got word of this, he said, no, I'm going to have to go back to service. And he went to Philadelphia, and he presided over that convention, and he kept pushing those delegates to compromise, to come together. Because Lord knows the big states had a plan, what they wanted. And the small states had their plan, and we had gridlock. And it was Washington, but it was also James Madison, and it was Roger Sherman from Connecticut. They finally came forward with the Connecticut Compromise. If you ever wondered why is it that we have a House of Representatives that's based on population, and every state gets 2 senators regardless of the size, that was a compromise. The Constitution itself was a compromise meant to drive compromise. This is what the whole point was. We were going to escape history. We were going to have peaceful, evolutionary change, not violent change. So this is critically important to understanding who we are as a people, as we have a hard time coming together today. But it was not only the legal arrangement. Quite frankly, it was also the political culture. When we talk about what does it mean to have an American dream, it was in part the pursuit of happiness, for sure. The idea that we have this potential in us and that we could rise to it based on our own hard work. But it was always balanced. Even at the very beginning, we had this idea of the pursuit of happiness, but it was balanced by our obligations to each other. Not necessarily in Washington, not even in Albany, but in our lives, in our obligations that we had to each other. When de Tocqueville came here, sent here in large part to study prisons, this was 40 years after the heads of state of Europe were trying to figure out, why is that working? Why aren't they begging for us to come back? When de Tocqueville came here, he said, this place is different. There's something about America. And he mentioned the legal arrangement, but he also talked to the political culture. He talked about the situation in Pennsylvania when a barn burned down. The people didn't get up and look to the government for an answer. They showed up on Saturday morning to raise a new barn to help each other. And so while we were Lockean, this is sort of John Locke, and this is all that had to do with the pursuit of happiness, we were, if we're being intellectually honest, we were also impacted at the very beginning by Rousseau's view of communitarianism and, quite frankly, the Puritans. And this was the idea that we are brother and sister's keeper. Just not necessarily in government, but we do care deeply about each other. This was a balance. Ladies and gentlemen, we don't have that balance anymore. We don't even have the legal framework in the way that it should. If you're wondering why we're struggling so much, I watched one morning, I saw Joe Scarborough say, the problem with America is we don't treat each other right. Well, it's obvious we're not treating each other right, but that's not the cause. The cause is we've drifted from founding principles. We used to do significant political change by rule of law, by working together, listening to each other, finding a compromise, enacting it from the people's representative and the President of the United States signing into law. Collaboration. We don't do significant political change that way anymore. We do significant political change largely by fiat, by executive orders and actions. As the first Republican ever in my family, I remember shuttling back and forth to Iraq about 12 years ago. And I remember hearing the left was saying, George Bush, he's got this Gitmo, he's got this enhanced interrogation, he's got these signing statements. The left was saying, we didn't even vote on any of this. This is all executive fiat. And I remember thinking, even as a Republican, I was saying, you know what? I got a point. Now the right was saying, well, it's the war. We got exigency. We just got to do it. A few years later, I'm sitting in the chamber as your representative. President Obama urging the Congress to act. He said, Congress, I urge you to act, but if you don't, I got a pen and I got a phone. Now here's what the interesting dynamic is this. The folks who were really critical of Bush because he was taking this executive action were standing up and cheering and saying, at last, finally, some action. And the right, which was apologizing for Bush and basically saying, this is the way it has to be under Bush, was, throwing a flag on the field and saying he can't do that. That's extra constitutional. Now you look today to 2018. And other than the tax bill, we haven't seen, which we could talk about in the Q&A, we have not seen any other significant legislation, yet President Trump says, I've done more than any other president. He's just making my point. Because anything he's doing has been through executive orders and actions. Ladies and gentlemen, this is where we are today. Is that the political change we are getting, even in the last 24, 48 hours, we're getting through executive orders and actions. This is not just an academic point. This is tearing us apart. Because what's happened is rather than working this through us, through the people, we the people, this is going through one person. And what's happening is in these presidential elections, it's all or nothing. It's a big battle. The parties would have to collaborate in the past. Now it's all about the big win for the presidency, and to the victor go the spoils of political change. To the loser, regardless of who it is, regardless of what party, they call into question the legitimacy of any action. This is what's ripping us apart. That and also the political culture. The political culture today is being assailed, that balance. That political culture is being assailed by both the left and the right. It's being assailed from the left through German idealism, the idea that the state is going to perfect mankind. I'm a realist on that. I don't think the state's ever going to perfect mankind. But it's also assailed from the right. This is the Ayn Rand, this idea of objectivism. And look, I enjoyed Atlas Shrugged. I mean, there's some things that I found. But here's the problem. Ayn Rand talked about, really, she criticized charity. She thought charity made people weak. We are our brother's keeper. We are our sister's keeper. This is undermining this political culture. And so where are we today in 2018? Well, where we used to have a balance between the individual and our obligations to each other, it's all the individual. When we used to have a balance between the now and the future, it's all about the now. And where we used to have a balance between the material and the spiritual, it's all the material. Now again, I'm not speaking against the individual at all. or the now at all, or the material. We are material beings. But the balance is necessary. Have you ever stopped and thought about this? That at a time that we've never been more connected, we've got 24/7 news cycle, we've got email, we've got social media, Twitter, everything else under the sun. We've never had higher readings of isolation, suicide, ideations, and completions. How can that be, that we're so connected, yet so alienated? We're looking for answers in all the wrong places. We are a material being. We have material needs, but we're a soulful being too. And we need to recognize that. This is what Rally Point is about. It's about finding that balance. It's about advocating for reform. And so what you'll see in these pages is you will see me arguing for ways that we can get reconnected to our government. And so this is a passionate call to action for citizens. We need to restore the bond between our representatives and our people. We have a hard time even meeting with our representatives now. We cannot be like this. We are one. We have to be able to have access to our representatives and our representatives' access to us. And so what I'm arguing for here is term limits. I'm arguing for independent redistricting. I'm arguing for campaign finance reform of the right kind. I'm arguing for lobbying bans. All this is designed to restore faith and confidence in our ability to be self-governing so that we can then pivot and start addressing the major issues of our time. This deficit and debt we have, it's going to be the end of us. You take a look at history, whether it was Greece, Roman Empire. I remind folks, look, there's still a Rome. My family was there last year. We had a great time. It's not the Rome of 2,000 years ago. I'm not worried about this land. This land here will be until the end of time. I'm worried about the United States of America and the American dream, about the possibility of American life. And this is why I believe we need to have this kind of reform. So I encourage you to read these pages. You will see the very strong voice for reform and renewal. But again, it's also a deeply personal story. And I'd hope you reach out to me. I'm having nice conversations across the country right now from people who have read it. cpg2@williams.edu. That is my email address if you have reactions to it. And at this point, I'd love to hear your questions and comments. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you. You got time, right? You got time for questions? You got time. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you. Thank you so much. We've got time for a dialogue. What's on your mind? I know we got questions out there. Please.
I'm interested in if you would be willing to identify 1, 2, or 3 pivot points where this new existence came into being.
Yeah. So we have seen this happen. The question is how did this all happen, right? So this has happened really almost for the last century, but it has been accelerated in the last 20 years. We have seen where we have, and by the way, it wasn't a heist. If you're thinking, well, the president came and picked the pocket of Congress, it didn't really go like that. Congress willingly gave up this power. This is now what many political scientists describe as the imperial presidency. Like, for example, war powers. At the very beginning, our founders knew that these were solemn decisions on the use of force when a country would go to war. That's why we were in charge of it. We, the people, were going to decide through our representatives when we would go to war. Today, we have presidents from both political parties that take us off to war without the consent of the governed. This is among the reforms that I'm advocating for. And when I was in Congress, I had a bill, the War Powers Reform Act, that ensured that we did not draw from the Treasury until such time that there was a vote from us. And so I would tell you that this has been part of this problem, is Congress has, over the time, they have pushed this off to the presidency. Why? These are hard decisions. Who wants to take that vote on war and peace? Because you may get criticized back home. By the way, what representative wants to take the vote on a balanced budget? It's got to happen. I was one of 38 in the country that voted for the Simpson Bowles budget that would have brought us back to a balanced budget. 38 in the whole country, 21 Democrats, 17 Republicans who voted for that. And it was very much a compromise. It was fiscally responsible, but it was necessary. So I think what's implied in the question is how are we going to do this? How are we going to come together? I would tell you that people are wondering, why is it that they can't come together? It's in part because of the district drawing. At this day and age, your media always wants to tell you about the partisanship. And there's too much of it. But what you miss is the bipartisan collusion that goes on behind closed doors every 10 years. Our Constitution requires we count everybody, the census. That's by the Constitution. After we count, we then go through a reapportionment and a redistricting process. But the problem is in the state houses, they get behind closed doors, and it's all about protecting incumbents. You ever wonder why some of these districts are drawn the way they are? So here's the issue. Over 95% of well over 95% of your members already know they're not going to face a competitive election in the fall because they got protected by the redistricting process. But they could face a competitive election in the spring in a primary if they're seen as coming together to do what is necessary. That is part of the problem that we're in today and why we need independent redistricting, because it will reflect us. If you think about it, think about this. You look at the polls today of the American people, and this goes beyond the partisan divide and the ideological spectrum. If you say, are you satisfied with Congress? It's like 8 or 9%. Yet the incumbent re-election rate is like 98 or 99%. Does that make sense to anybody? It's because of this phenomenon that I'm describing to you. This is what's got to change. Because I will tell you, ladies and gentlemen, it's this serious. I think we're either going to do Rally Point or something like it, or we're going to come apart. We're going to come apart. And the interesting thing about Americans is we're incredible people. In the history of time, I put nobody up against us. I think that we're the most amazing folks. But you know what? We got to be careful about some things. Because as Americans, we have certain articles of faith. We have certain beliefs. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west, and America will always be as we are today. There is no guarantee on that. Every generation has to renew the American dream. And we're in real peril right now. We've got to find a way to come together and enact these reforms. What you're hearing right now is California. California's talking about seceding, but you know what? And oftentimes when we read our history, we blame the South, right, for the secession. The first vote on breaking up the country was not in the South. It's actually at Hartford. It was in the Northeast. And it was the Federalist Party. By the way, it brought about the end of the Federalist Party. But when they did not, the War of 1812 did not sit well with the Northeast, and they took a vote. Now, it didn't pass, but the vote came within a couple votes of passing. So what I'm sharing with you is that we're going to have to find a way to rediscover these founding principles, or we will come apart. And part of it is this reform, and I've laid out some of it, and you can read more of it in detail, but I have to tell you one other thing. And it's this. We also have to recognize that in America we have enormous diversity of thought, and that's a good thing. We shouldn't try to homogenize thought. Part of the challenge we're dealing with today is that California and New York are trying to make Alabama look like California and New York, and Alabama wants California and New York to look like Alabama. Now, one of the things from Mary Jo and I, our military service, is we've seen a lot of right ways to do things because we've lived all over the country, and we've seen some not so right ways. But here's the thing. When California, I think it's too statist, quite frankly, but I defend their right to do it. California has a choice. They can vote for these things. I don't think we should use the arm of the federal government to homogenize thought. Now, we have time now where it's Republican control. But I think it would be a misuse of power to use the federal government to cause California and New York to look like Alabama. But at the same time, I think that also California and New York need to recognize that Alabama is going to look like Alabama, and people have choices. So if you happen to be a Republican in a blue state like me, here's my choices. One is hopefully to convince people that more liberty is the way to go, that we are brothers and sisters keeper, but there are ways to do that at lower levels of government. That's my first option, is to try to convince people. My second option is, if I think that our rights have been stepped on, is to go to court. But I should not use the federal government. I should not use the Congress to checkmate the state. I think that that is wrong. I don't think that that's in line with founding principles, and I think that's part of the challenge that we're dealing with today. Other questions? Yes, please.
So, as someone on a college campus now, the younger generations that you're seeing, are they tainted by the fact that they've grown up in a time when the government is operating like this? Or are they a little more idealistic that perhaps their generation is going to be able to take us back to a time when we're more civil?
Well, great question. Question was on what's the atmosphere on campus. It's a bit curious, to be candid with you. I happen to be very high on millennials. Sometimes I get criticized for that. I mean, in the pages of Rally Point, you'll see why. I do talk about the fact that when I led young men and women in combat, when they were shot at, they stepped forward. So, occasionally when I would come home on leave, I would have some of my friends who I grew up with. They're like, how about this young generation? They're always on video games and everything like that. And candidly, I would hear nothing of it, because I have seen the sacrifices of this young generation. And incidentally, from a view of history, this has always been done to us. I mean, Hitler underestimated us too. He thought we were soft, couldn't fight him, couldn't handle this. We've always been underestimated. And I think millennials are being underestimated. I think that they actually have incredible attributes. When you take a look at millennials today, because this gets to the question, is millennials are generally fiscally responsible, but they're also socially inclusive. I actually think that's in line with the founding. Now, when I say the founding, I'm not talking about 1776. I'm talking about the ideas we put on paper. I mentioned I watched this show, 1968. One of the scenes from this documentary, maybe some of you saw it, was Dr. Martin Luther King. And what Dr. King said is, I just want America to live up to what it put on paper. Exactly right. But you know what? Our documents were aspirational. This is one of the reasons why I think we should stand for the Pledge of Allegiance and should stand for the national anthem, is it's not a comment about today. The national anthem is about an aspiration. It's what we hope to be on our best day, and we ought to agree on that, right? And so Dr. King constantly invoked the founding. In fact, he said, I'm here to cash a check. I'm here to cash a check on what this country promised, that everyone be able to rise to their God-given potential. I couldn't agree with that more. I think that is the founding at its best. If you're a law-abiding citizen, you have every right to the American dream. Every single person, regardless of any background. And so I think millennials really reflect this. And so the question was, what are they like on campus? Well, on the one hand, they're idealistic. They're idealistic in the idea that they would interact with each other. To be candid with you, they're more realistic when it comes to government. And that's one of the reasons why what I'm concerned about is they don't vote in the big numbers, is because they've really kind of checked out. They're not counting on Washington. They've grown up seeing the dysfunction, the divide, and the angst, and they kind of think, well, that's not the answer. But that is a danger. And I think that, this is the government of the people, by the people, for the people. It will be exactly the government that we demand. And that's one of the reasons why I'm bringing forward this framework, is because I believe we need to insist as a people. Because even though I don't hold an elected office, I now hold a very important office, and as you do, arguably the most important office in the United States of America is citizen. Citizen, because you know what? The founders put sovereignty in you, Don. They put sovereignty in us. And they believed in us when nobody else did. The idea that we could be self-governing. And so I think millennials, the challenge is really getting them to call up their idealism that they share in their economic lives and social lives, in their governmental lives. Other questions? Please.
This is my own paranoid concern.
Yes.
What checks and balances might there be on a tweet that the current president might do to have a nuclear war with North Korea out of ego rather than a threat to America?
Okay, so it's a good question. This question has to do with what is the law And what are the checks and balances as it relates to launching any nuclear attack? All right, the way the U.S. law works is there's actually a requirement. It's very interesting the way I've looked into this law. It's very interesting the way it's put together. Because at the one hand, you want unity of effort, right? In case we have to make a call, some other country has launched weapons against us. But at the same time, we're not a country that believes in one person should control completely anything. So what our law says is that there has to be authentication. That authentication comes from the Secretary of Defense. So the president cannot, by himself or herself, cannot launch nuclear weapons. There has to be an authentication from the Secretary of Defense. Now, at least you think, well, then you're not going to have unity of effort. Well, the president can actually fire the Secretary of Defense. So this is why I'm saying there's a nuance here. I actually think that they did a good job putting this law together, because we need to strike a balance between the need for unity of effort and also to have checks and balances. So, the Secretary of Defense, General Mattis, retired. I mean, he's somebody who I know personally and somebody who I really hold in high regard, and he believes in peace through strength. And I think nothing would make him happier than to see this young generation never have to see a shot fired in anger. So I believe he is a check, both in his counsel and also in his actions, that we would have thoughtful decisions when it comes to that. So that's where we are on that piece.
But I'm concerned about Bolton too, and a few others.
So the follow-up point was on the National Security Advisor Bolton. But remember, the NSA has no legal authority to launch anything. The NSA is somebody who provides information, analysis, and advice, but has no legal authority. Other questions? Yes, please.
Yes, Marcy Goulart, Ulster County Democratic Women. First of all, Chris, I want to commend you on the fact that you're a man of good word, that you believe in term limits and campaign reform. My question is, how do we elect people to office who will work for our best interests and will get to Congress and the Senate and actually do the hard work that needs to be done?
Okay, so it's a question about accountability. And representation. Transparency, accountability, and representation. So let's be very candid here. The fact of the matter is that in any election, about half of the Americans don't vote. So, part of what we have to do is, I think, as a former elected member, I think that really falls on me. I felt like if people aren't voting, it's because they don't find something to get behind. Look, it's easier to vote now than it is to take a book out of a library. So I don't think it's an issue of making it easier to vote. I think we have to give people something to believe in and something to get behind. So I do think leaders have to work harder to earn support. But then also, I think, candidly, we're going to have to deal with this the way the district lines are drawn. That's part of the challenge that we're having right now, is because when these members show up in Washington, D.C., they are self-interested. And of course, when you look at what we did in the Constitution, that's part of what we did. I didn't get into it in the initial set of remarks, but the initial expression of the spirit of Philadelphia was very, very idealistic. The idea that, that was the Declaration. The Constitution was more realistic. It said, look, we're a government that's based on self-interest, that everybody has self-interest. It's sort of Adam Smithian, but it'll be buttressed by a civic obligation to each other. So when I say that members of Congress are self-interested, it's cross-party lines. They are. They want to get reelected. But I think the way that we the people, keep a check on that is we make sure that the district lines make these races competitive. Because I think that way we keep them on their toes, and they're also interested in what we have to say. Because when these district lines become so hardened, either ruby red or deep blue, they're not as interested in solving the problems such as balanced budgets, such as other decisions we've had to make. They really don't want to make, because the situation we're in today is that everybody wants their 100% solution. If you were to say in theory to a Democrat or Republican, do you think we should be spending beyond our means? Because we don't do it in our daily lives. They say no. But yet they won't support the Simpson-Bowles compromise because it's not pure. And they mostly come from districts that are pure. And that's not going to be helpful to us, because guess what, especially in today when we're so divided, to put a finer point on it, our deficit is on track to be over $1 trillion next year. at a time that we have full employment. You know, and we're looking at this deficit this year at the end of 30 September is going to be almost 900 billion, and it's going to be over $1 trillion next year. And what we're paying on nothing but interest is about $500 billion. Think of the opportunity cost. And we know that now that we've had full employment, the interest rates now are going back to normal rates. That means that you're paying more for your compounded debt. What I'm sharing with you is this doesn't get easier. It gets harder. And as divided as we are, if all of a sudden we have another 2008 where the market goes crazy because of the problems with our structural decisions think about what that's going to be like, kindling to the country, because what's immediately going to happen, everybody's going to want somebody to blame. The market just dipped all this, my goodness, somebody's going to have to be held, somebody's going to have to be blamed, and we're going to get into more scapegoating than we are into problem solving. And so it actually is related to the lady's question. Is this accountability and transparency? And I think, that's what I would share with you, is we have to stay engaged, not give up, and hold our representatives accountable, and work towards reform. The reform listed out, independent redistricting is one of them, but it's a number of other things too, including, as was mentioned, the campaign finance. The situation we're in right now, just to put a finer point on that, last cycle, 2016, over 95% of the political donations in this country came from less than 200 people. Country of 320 million Americans, that can't stand. We cannot have this. And I'm a believer in conservatism, but I believe strongly in my ideas. It's not just corporations. Corporations are part of the problem, but it's also the unlimited giving that individuals can give now. We had a court decision that basically allowed this to be the case. But we have to stop this. It calls into question the idea of one person, one vote. And if you believe, if you believe strongly in your ideas, then you don't need to skew the system. It was the same. I had a reporter once asking me, Gibson, you went from a Republican district to a district that voted for Obama twice, and we never seen you complain about you were the only Republican that got so-called weaker in the redistricting process. Because I don't believe that representatives should be picking their voters. We have this illusion that we pick our representatives when too often representatives pick their voters every 10 years through this process. I believe enough in the ideas that I stand behind that I'm happy to let the chips fall where they may. Okay, other questions? Yes, please.
It used to be that people, including politicians, disagreed on issues, but they accepted underlying evidence-based facts. How do we carry on a dialogue and solve problems in a post-factual society wherein people just have their own alternative facts?
Well, look, this is part of the challenge that we're in. Take a look at where we are today. And I used to do this when I was your representative. I used to go and listen. I'd come to all these community events. I really enjoyed them. And I would start to hear a line of thought. And it was clear to me where they were going for the information. Generally speaking, where we are today is most Americans go to news sources that reinforce their views that they already have. And when I was in Iraq, I couldn't afford to do that. I went everywhere for information because, situational awareness was so important to making good choices. So when, as a member, I would meet with, I met with MoveOn.org, I met with Tea Party groups and everybody in between. And sometimes, like say for example, I was with Tea Party groups and they'd say, well, where did you go for your information? Everywhere. Well, no, where did you go? Fox, MSNBC. MSNBC? You watched MSNBC? Oh, heck yeah. Because I wanted to know what they were saying. And it was interesting to me that I would sometimes in an evening, when I finished around 2,300 hours, I would watch 15 minutes of one and 15 minutes of another, and you'd think they're from different planets. This is part of the challenge we're dealing with. As a leader, I had to find a way to explain the phenomenon and then talk about what I was doing because it was already highly politicized. So I can tell you there is no... right now, you will find that both sides feel that they have a monopoly on facts. The left thinks that the right's out to lunch and not using facts, and you know what? The right feels the same way about the left. That's why, you'll hear the president talk about fake news. It's on both sides. And part of it is, I actually believe that this is a period that if we enact these reforms, I want you to know I'm hopeful. Even in the face of all this, I'm hopeful. Because I think the American people, there will be an undertow to all this. And I think there'll be a spirit for reform, and I think there'll be a spirit for renewal. And when we come through and we look back on this 30 years from now, we'll recognize, okay, here's some things we need to learn from this. And part of it is the way we even get our information. We need to be more careful consumers of how we get information. So you don't need to raise hands, but if you go to all one side, whether it's the left or the right, what I would tell you is just for the heck of it, try going to the other side and seeing what they have to say. If for no other reason, it's going to put you in a stronger position for empathy. You know, when I teach the students today, I mean, I teach a course on leadership, national security, and foreign policy. On the leadership course, one of our lessons is on Daniel Goleman's emotional intelligence. I strongly recommend it if you haven't seen Goleman's work. But you know, one of the things Goleman was trying to explain was how is it that Ronald Reagan, who was a C student at Eureka College, could rise to be President of the United States? Well, what he found is, and he was a hero of mine, Ronald Reagan, one of the reasons why I became the first Republican ever in my family. But you know, what Goleman found, he found this, that yes, IQ is important. You know, intelligence quotient is important. But at least as important, quite frankly, maybe more important, was EI, emotional intelligence. And that is our ability to affiliate with others as defined by 5 different variables. One of them was self-awareness, which should lead to self-regulation. If you're self-aware but you don't self-regulate, you haven't really hit your potential. The third point is motivation. The fourth was empathy. We can never truly know what it's like to be somebody else, but we ought to try. We ought to try. And then empathy should lead to social skill. Goleman says when you look at those 5 variables, if you're really good at those 5 variables, even if you're only above average intelligence, you're probably really going to succeed. And that's why I use it in response to your question, because, I mean, I am a guy of average or maybe slightly above average intelligence. But my parents really brought me up in a way that, I mean, I didn't know the term emotional intelligence, but my parents really brought me up to respect other points of view, to listen, to be able to understand where people are coming from. And so when I read Goleman, I was like, that guy gets it. And I think that that's part of what's missing today, is we're immediately activated and triggered out by the extremes when we could all do better to take a step back and just sort of listen to each other. And I think we would find this. And I say this from experience now. Because I did mention the divide, but I'll tell you what. You want to see real divide? Go to Iraq. Go to the Balkans. I spent time in Kosovo. I mean, my first week in the Balkans, I was asked to go out on a mission. And I'm listening to people through an interpreter. And I realized they're talking about the Battle of Polje. That was 1389. I'm certainly not going to be able to solve the Battle of Polje. You know, in this country, we have disagreements. But on any 10 issues, we may have pretty strong disagreement on 5, 6, maybe even 7. But you know what, as Americans, I bet we at least have 3 or 4 things that we agree upon. And our government is meant to work on those things initially, and then find a way to build consensus on all the remainder. So that's what I would tell you, is we've got to find a way to listen to each other better. Well, I hope you do read Rally Point. Send me your feedback. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.